Between 1843 and 1847, every spring, at least 7 daughters from Mississippi's wealthiest plantation families vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever discovered. No investigations were ever brought to completion. To European finishing schools or marriages to distant cousins in Charleston was where the families claimed their daughters had been sent. But within the forgotten archives of Adams County, a leather-bound diary exists that tells a different story. The story of a treatment so brutal, so methodically cruel, that 3 men were willing to risk their lives to stop it. What really happened in the barn at Kellerman Estate and why Catherine Kellerman's body was never found, this is that account. Before the story of the Kellerman Plantation and the darkest secret Mississippi society ever buried continues, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one, stories they tried to erase from history, need to be told. And in the comments, tell me what state you are listening from. Let's see how far this story reaches. With her mother's obsession, the truth about Catherine Kellerman's fate began, but with a revelation that would shake the foundations of Mississippi's elite society, it ended. A monument to Southern prosperity and carefully maintained appearances was Natchez, Mississippi, in the spring of 1843. Not just in cotton yields and land holdings, but in the perfection of their bloodlines, the elegance of their daughters, and the absolute control they wielded over every aspect of their domain, the city's plantation families competed. Like white temples, mansions rose along the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, each one proclaiming its owner's superiority through Greek columns and manicured gardens that required dozens of enslaved hands to maintain. Nearly 4,000 acres of prime cotton land 15 miles northeast of Natchez proper was occupied by the Kellerman estate. A rare occurrence that made her both wealthy and deeply resentful of the scrutiny such independence brought was inheriting the property from her father in 1831 for Lucinda Kellerman. At 42 years old, she had transformed herself into the arbiter of social acceptability among the plantation elite. For their exactitude, her dinner parties were legendary. At precisely the right angle, the silver had to gleam. In the French style she had studied during a brief stay in New Orleans, the flowers had to be arranged. Through a regimen of vinegar water and tight corseting that left her perpetually breathless but undeniably fashionable, her own figure remained reed-thin. Everything her mother despised was represented by Catherine Kellerman at 19 years old. Where Lucinda was angular and sharp, Catherine had inherited her deceased father's tendency toward weight. She was considered grotesquely obese by the standards of 1843, her body refusing to conform to the willowy ideal that Lucinda worshipped. But to her mother, Catherine's size was not merely a physical characteristic. It was a deliberate rebellion, a public humiliation, a stain on the Kellerman name that grew more pronounced with each passing month. To her closest confidants, her voice dripping with disgust, Lucinda would say, "She eats like a field hand." I have given her every advantage, every opportunity to become a lady of quality, and she repays me with this grotesque display of indulgence. What Lucinda never mentioned, what she perhaps could not admit even to herself, was that following the death of her father, Thomas Kellerman, in 1839, Catherine's weight had begun its dramatic increase. Heart failure had been the official cause. The whispered truth, known only to a select few, was that Thomas had died in his study with an empty bottle of laudanum beside him, and a letter to Catherine clutched in his hand, a letter that Lucinda had burned before anyone else could read it. With the brutal efficiency that Lucinda demanded in all things, the Kellerman plantation operated. The cotton fields, the house, the gardens, and the various outbuildings that kept the estate functioning were worked by 237 enslaved people. Among them were 3 men who would become central to Catherine's story, though none of them could have anticipated the roles they would be forced to play. 34 years old, born on the Kellerman plantation, and trained from childhood as a blacksmith was Joshua Fletcher. A strength that made him valuable for any task requiring raw power was possessed by his hands, scarred from years of hammer work. He spoke little, observed much, and kept a mental catalogue of every cruelty he witnessed, storing them away like coins he might one day spend on justice. At a Natchez auction in 1841, the second man, Samuel Hayes, had been purchased. At 28, he had already survived 3 different owners, each one worse than the last. Not just his physical strength, but his literacy was what made Samuel valuable to Lucinda. His previous owner, a bankrupt merchant, had used Samuel to keep accounts, a skill that was both rare and dangerous for an enslaved person to possess. Utility in this education was seen by Lucinda, using Samuel to manage the plantation's grain stores and livestock records, always under her watchful supervision. From a failing plantation in Louisiana, a 16-year-old boy named Daniel Cooper, purchased specifically for his youth and strength, was the third. Horrors in his short life that had left him with a stutter and a tendency to flinch at sudden movements had been witnessed by Daniel. But he was also observant in ways that others missed, noticing patterns and details that would later prove crucial. At the eastern edge of the main property stood the barn where Catherine's story would unfold. A massive structure built in 1820 to store cotton bales before they were transported to the river. By 1843, a newer warehouse had been constructed closer to the water, and the old barn had been relegated to grain storage and equipment repair. By a grove of live oaks invisible from the mansion's windows, it was isolated from the main house, a perfect place for activities that required discretion. In a false bottom of a trunk discovered decades later, Lucinda's diary reveals the exact moment when her plan took shape. Today I observed the Ashworth girl, once a plump and unmarriageable creature, now transformed into a vision of delicate beauty, reads the entry dated March 15, 1843. The method of this miraculous change, labor, constant, unrelenting physical labor, was confided in me by Mrs. Ashworth. The body, when pushed beyond its limits, consumes itself. It burns away the excess, revealing the form that God intended. Why should this remedy be available only to the Ashworths? Why should my own daughter remain a monument to gluttony when salvation is so simple? I have the means. I have the place. I have the workers who will obey without question. Catherine's transformation begins tomorrow. What Lucinda did not write, but what would later become clear, was that at a terrible cost had come Margaret Ashworth's transformation. The girl had developed a persistent cough that no doctor could cure. Her hand shook constantly. A vacant quality that suggested something fundamental had broken inside her was held by her eyes. But she was thin, and in Lucinda Kellerman's world, that was all that mattered. On layers of secrets and silent agreements operated the social structure of Natchez society in 1843. Things they pretended not to know were known by everyone. Things they agreed not to see were seen by everyone. This conspiracy of silence was not passive. Through careful social engineering, it was actively maintained. To question another family's private business was to invite questions about one's own. To express concern for a daughter's welfare was to suggest that one's own methods of child-rearing might be suspect. Through mutual complicity, the system protected itself. On understanding and exploiting these unspoken rules, Lucinda Kellerman had built her reputation. She knew exactly how far she could push the boundaries of acceptable behavior before crossing into scandal. She knew which families would ask no questions, which doctors would provide certificates of health without examination, which ministers would preach about the virtue of discipline without specifying its methods. To the main house, Lucinda summoned Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel on March 16, 1843. It was unusual for field workers to be brought into the parlor, and the three men stood uncomfortably among the fine furniture and delicate china, acutely aware that their very presence violated the careful boundaries that kept the plantation's dual reality separate. "Gentlemen," Lucinda began, her voice carrying the false warmth she used when giving orders she expected to be obeyed without question. "A special task for you, I have. My daughter Catherine requires physical rehabilitation. Weak and indolent, unsuited for the duties that will one day befall her as mistress of this estate, she has become. In the East Barn, you will oversee her daily labors. From dawn until dusk, you will ensure she works. In a ledger I will provide, you will document her progress, and to no one under penalty of punishment, you will speak of this. I trust one do not need to describe, the threat hung in the air, unspoken but understood. The whip, the sale to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, or worse meant disobedience. But there was something in Lucinda's eyes that went beyond the usual cruelty of an owner enforcing her will. There was anticipation, almost excitement, as if she were about to conduct an experiment whose results she eagerly awaited. About this arrangement, Catherine herself was not consulted. On the morning of March 17, she was led from her bedroom by her mother's personal maid and taken to the barn, still wearing her nightdress under a simple work dress that Lucinda had selected. No surprise, only a deep resignation that suggested this was merely the latest in a long series of humiliations her mother had devised showed the girl's face. With mechanical efficiency that felt rehearsed, as if Lucinda had planned every detail of Catherine's degradation, began the first morning in the barn. With military precision, Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel had been given their instructions. Using the manual stone mill, Catherine was to grind corn, carry 50-pound sacks of grain from one end of the barn to the other, and split firewood until her hands blistered. Not for productivity, but for exhaustion was the work designed. Each task calibrated to push her body beyond its limits while producing just enough useful output to justify the labor if anyone asked questions. Every sound was amplified by the barn itself. Off the high ceiling echoed the grinding of stone against grain. A rhythm that the three men found themselves unconsciously matching became Catherine's labored breathing. Like a clock seemed to mark time the creak of the building's old timbers. A reminder of hours passing in brutal sameness was each groan of wood. In those first days was Catherine's silence what struck Samuel most. She did not complain. She did not plead. Except to ask for water, which they were instructed to provide sparingly, she did not even speak. As she worked, her face remained expressionless as if she had removed herself from her body and was watching from a great distance. At precisely 3 o'clock, Lucinda arrived each afternoon, her skirts rustling against the barn floor as she circled her daughter like a buyer inspecting livestock. A leather journal she carried, and in it she recorded measurements, observations, and assessments with clinical detachment. Weight estimated 195 pounds, she wrote on March 20, face remains bloated. Slight reduction in circumference show arms. Unfortunately but necessary, hands developing calluses. Appropriately subdued temperament. As expected, the treatment progresses. But only part of the story was told by Lucinda's journal entries. The private conversations she was having with other plantation ladies who had daughters they considered problematic were what she did not record. Mrs. Helena Cartwright, whose daughter Rebecca had been caught reading abolitionist literature smuggled from the North. Mrs. Beatrice Singleton, whose daughter Emma had refused 3 suitable marriage proposals, insisting she wanted to study medicine. Mrs. Constance Whitfield, whose daughter Sarah had been discovered teaching enslaved children to read in secret. Under various pretenses, afternoon tea, garden consultations, discussions of upcoming social events, these women visited Kellerman Estate, but they always asked to see the barn, and Lucinda always obliged, leading them through the grove of oaks to witness Catherine's transformation. "You see," Lucinda would say, gesturing to her daughter's exhausted form. "The body responds to discipline just as the spirit does. Already the excess begins to melt away with 3 weeks of proper labor. What 3 months might accomplish, 6 months, a year, imagine." The visitors took notes. They asked questions about methods, duration, supervision. They inquired about dietary restrictions and whether Catherine was permitted any leisure time. With the enthusiasm of a scientist sharing breakthrough research, Lucinda answered each question. "No leisure," she confirmed. "Leisure is what created this problem. Idleness and indulgence are sisters, breeding weakness in our daughters. Here Catherine learns the value of work. She learns that comfort must be earned. She learns that her body is not her own to ruin with gluttony." By April, the first of the other girls arrived. On her family's property, Rebecca Cartwright was delivered to a barn, overseen by 3 enslaved men who had been given the same instructions as Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel. 2 weeks later, Emma Singleton followed, then Sarah Whitfield. Each family modified the approach to suit their particular needs, but the core remained the same: isolation, labor, and the breaking of will disguised as physical improvement. That their daughters might speak to one another was what none of these mothers anticipated. The plantations were spread across the county, but enslaved workers moved between properties carrying messages and news. A pattern began to be noticed by Daniel, who was sometimes sent to deliver grain to neighboring estates. Barns that had been used for storage were suddenly off limits. Young white women who had been fixtures at social gatherings were suddenly absent, their mothers explaining they were unwell or visiting relatives. Others there are, Daniel whispered to Samuel one evening as they secured the barn for the night. I seen them. Girls working like Catherine, looking just as tired, just as scared. Something cold settled in Samuel's stomach. An isolated act of cruelty was not what they were witnessing. A system carefully constructed and expanding it was. To Catherine was happening something unexpected inside the barn. Brutal was the work, designed to break her, but it was also the first time in years she had been away from her mother's constant scrutiny and criticism. In the barn, she was simply a body performing tasks. There were no mirrors to reflect her failure to meet impossible standards. There were no dinner parties where she was displayed as evidence of her mother's disappointment. And there were Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel, who treated her with a careful respect that surprised her. They did not mock her size. They did not comment on her appearance. When she struggled with a particularly heavy load, Joshua would quietly position himself to take some of the weight without making it obvious. When her hands bled from the rough wood, Samuel brought clean rags and showed her how to wrap them to prevent infection. When she stumbled from exhaustion, Daniel caught her and studied her without judgment. On April 8, 6 weeks into her confinement, was the first time Catherine spoke beyond requesting water. During the brief noon break, she was resting, and Joshua was repairing a piece of equipment nearby. "Do you hate me?" she asked quietly. On the tools, Joshua's hand stilled. He did not look at her directly, knowing such eye contact could be seen as insubordination if anyone observed them. "No, miss," he replied carefully. "You should," Catherine continued. "I am everything you should hate. The daughter of your owner, living in comfort while you suffer. I would hate me." The caution of a man who knew that honesty could cost him his life was used by Joshua to choose his words. "Hate takes energy, miss. Energy better spent on surviving." A simple statement, but it opened something in Catherine. For the first time, she began to see the three men not as extensions of her mother's will, but as human beings trapped in the same cruel system, albeit in profoundly different ways. The conversations grew longer, always conducted in careful whispers during breaks or in the early morning before Lucinda's inspection. Catherine learned that Joshua had a wife and 2 children living in the quarters, that Samuel had once lived in a city and could read and write better than most white men, that Daniel dreamed of the freedom he might never experience. In turn, the men learned about Catherine's life in the mansion, which was its own form of imprisonment, the endless rules about deportment and dress, the constant criticism of every bite of food, every word spoken, every breath taken, the isolation from other young people her age because her mother deemed her too shameful to be seen. "She wants me to disappear," Catherine said one morning in May. The daughter she imagined, not the one she has, she wants that. So she could tell people I died of a wasting disease and finally be rid of her embarrassment. I think she hoped this work would kill me. A chill at these words was felt by Samuel, who had been listening while pretending to organize grain sacks, because he had begun to suspect something similar. Less frequent had become Lucinda's visits, but when she came, she seemed disappointed rather than pleased by Catherine's survival. Yes, the girl was losing weight, but she was also growing stronger from the labor. Muscle definition showed in her arms. Her breathing had become easier. As Lucinda had perhaps hoped, she was not wasting away. She was adapting. Darker grew the diary entries from Lucinda Kellerman's journal as spring turned to summer. Her clinical observations gave way to frustration, then to a cold calculation that suggested she was considering more extreme measures. June 3, 1843. Despite the rigors of labor, Catherine persists in her corpulence. Minimal weight reduction. Perhaps the rations must be further restricted. Perhaps the work must extend into the night hours. Marked improvement has been shown by the Cartwright girl, I'm told. Why should Catherine be different? What Lucinda did not know was that Catherine's meager rations had been supplemented by Joshua with food from the quarters. Not much, just enough to keep her from the dangerous malnutrition that was making the other girls sick. At great personal risk, he did this, sharing portions that his own family needed, because he had begun to see something in Catherine that reminded him of his own daughter, a fundamental innocence, a desire to be seen as human rather than object. But other changes were happening. Subtle shifts in the dynamic within the barn that none of them had anticipated. More freely during the long hours of work had Catherine and Joshua begun to speak. From brief exchanges about tasks evolved what started into conversations about life, hope, and the absurdity of a world that valued some lives over others based on skin color or body shape. "Your mother would have me whipped for looking at you directly," Joshua said one afternoon as they worked together to move a broken piece of equipment. "But here in this barn, working side by side, what is the difference between us? We both bleed. We both tire. We both want freedom from the things that bind us." The parallel had never been considered by Catherine before. Certainly, her imprisonment was different from Joshua's, but it was still imprisonment. She could not leave the barn. She could not make choices about her own body or her own life. As a problem to be solved, a defect to be corrected, she existed only. In late June was the first time they touched with intention rather than accident. Catherine had been lifting a sack of grain when her strength failed and she stumbled. Joshua caught her, and for a moment they stood close enough to feel each other's breath. Neither moved away. With possibility and danger in equal measure, the air between them seemed to thicken. "We should not," Catherine whispered, but she did not step back. "No," Joshua agreed. "We should not." Yet neither of them moved. In that barn, isolated from the world, they had created a space where the rules of plantation society seemed distant and negotiable. Perhaps inevitable was what happened next, or perhaps it was a choice they both made, knowing the consequences, but choosing connection over safety. In stolen moments, always with Samuel and Daniel serving as unwitting guards, warning them if anyone approached, their relationship developed into something deeper, a genuine affection that transcended the impossible circumstances of their situation, evolved what began as comfort. But a way of revealing themselves have secrets, and by mid-July, both Samuel and Daniel knew what was happening. Neither spoke of it directly, but they adjusted their positions to provide more privacy, created tasks that required Catherine and Joshua to work in the back corner of the barn, turned their attention elsewhere during the brief moments when the two sought each other's company. "This will end badly," Samuel said to Daniel one evening after Catherine had been returned to the main house and Joshua had left for the quarters. "Well ends this story in no version." Daniel, who at 16 understood the world's cruelty in ways that should have been beyond his years, nodded slowly. "Maybe, but maybe some happiness they deserve, even if it is brief. Maybe that is all any of us get." The change in her daughter was failed to be noticed by Lucinda, consumed with her expanding operation of rehabilitation barns across the county. She was too busy documenting her methods, corresponding with interested families as far away as Alabama and Georgia, and calculating the profit she might derive from offering her expertise as a consultant on reforming wayward daughters. Her ambitions are revealed by her journal from July 12. Interest in the treatment methodology has exceeded all expectations. A detailed protocol has been requested in writing by Mrs. Patricia Rutherford from Mobile. A daughter who insists on painting rather than focusing on suitable accomplishments, she has. About outcomes, Mrs. Vivian Caldwell from Savannah inquires, expressing concern about a daughter who has developed an unseemly interest in the family's financial affairs. Considerable is the potential for expansion. An appropriate title would be The Correction of Female Indolence Through Measured Labor, perhaps a published treatise on the subject. But while Lucinda planned her empire of cruelty, a change that had nothing to do with weight loss was undergoing Catherine's body. By early August, she began experiencing morning sickness. To the poor food and constant exhaustion, she at first attributed it. But when her monthly courses failed to arrive, she understood what had happened. During a quiet moment when Samuel and Daniel were occupied at the far end of the barn, she told Joshua first. "With child, I am," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "Your child." A series of expressions went through Joshua's face. Shock, fear, and then a tenderness that made Catherine's eyes fill with tears. But what this meant was known by them both. Impossible to hide would be a pregnancy. Catastrophic would be the consequences when Lucinda discovered it. "You they will kill," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "For this, my mother will have you killed." To ensure no one speaks of it, perhaps all three of you. A gesture so dangerous and so necessary that neither cared who might see was Joshua taking her hands in his. Then to plan, we have time. To find a way out of this, we have time. But information required planning, and risk required information. Samuel, using his literacy and his occasional access to the plantation office, began to gather what he could. Bills of sale, property records, correspondence between plantations. Anything that might reveal the extent of Lucinda's network, any weakness they might exploit was what he was looking for. Worse than he had imagined was what he found. Entries that suggested at least 4 other girls had gone through Lucinda's treatment before Catherine were hidden in a ledger marked household expenses. Next to each name was a final entry, disposed of, natural causes or transferred to family in Texas or simply resolved. What does a resolved mean? Daniel asked when Samuel showed him the entries late one night. Grim was Samuel's expression. Nothing good. Nothing good at all. Clear was the pattern. Girls who did not respond to the treatment, who did not lose weight or who proved too rebellious, simply disappeared from the records. Certificates of death or letters explaining they had been sent away for their own good were received by their families. But there were no graves, no forwarding addresses, no trail to follow. More danger than she knows is Catherine in, Samuel said. Even without the pregnancy, if her mother decides she has failed the treatment, she will simply be resolved. Like the others. They needed to act. But resources they did not have would require any action. Money, documents, transportation. Carefully out of reach of those who needed them most were kept the tools of freedom. By Catherine was suggested the impossible solution. My father's study, she said. Before he died, he kept money hidden there. Papers, too. Documents about the plantation. That room, my mother never goes in. After his death, she had it locked. But I know where the key is hidden. Born of desperation and the slim hope that the impossible might somehow become possible was the plan they devised. Increased illness from the labor would be feigned by Catherine, providing an excuse to be taken back to the main house more frequently. During one of these visits, she would access her father's study and retrieve whatever money and documents she could find. With these resources, false freedom papers and passage north would be attempted to be secured by Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel. But precision and luck in equal measure was required by every aspect of the plan. On the second floor of the mansion was the study, accessible only by passing through rooms where house servants worked constantly. In Lucinda's own bedroom was hidden the key, inside a music box that had belonged to Catherine's grandmother. And perfect had to be the timing. Occupied elsewhere would Lucinda need to be. Distracted would the servants need to be, and an alibi for why Catherine had been allowed to leave would need to be created by the men in the barn. On August 17, 1843, they attempted the first phase. Of severe abdominal pain complained Catherine, crying out with such conviction that even Samuel, who knew she was performing, felt concerned. The performance worked. Irritated by the interruption to her afternoon correspondence, Lucinda ordered Catherine taken to the house and confined to her room. If she is malingering, she will return to the barn tomorrow for double labor, Lucinda announced. If she is genuinely ill, Dr. Harrison will examine her and provide appropriate treatment. Terrified Catherine was the mention of a doctor. Her pregnancy would be revealed by any examination. Perhaps 24 hours she had to access the study and return to the barn before her condition became impossible to conceal. That evening, while Lucinda attended a dinner party at a neighboring plantation, Catherine waited until the house settled into its nightly routine. The patterns were known by her. By 9 o'clock, the servants would finish their evening duties. By 10 o'clock, her mother's personal maid would retire, and the house would be quiet until the kitchen staff began their work at 5 o'clock in the morning. Of 7 hours, she had a window. Exactly where she remembered was the music box, on Lucinda's dressing table. As she opened it, Catherine's hand shook, wincing at the tinkling melody that seemed impossibly loud in the silent house. There was the key, small and iron, attached to a ribbon that had faded from blue to grey. of old leather and tobacco smelled her father's study, scents that brought back memories of a time before everything had gone wrong, before her father's mysterious death, before her mother's cruelty had found its full expression. One moment of grief Catherine allowed herself before focusing on the task. In a false bottom of a desk drawer was the money, exactly where her father had shown her years ago. $300 in various bills, a fortune that could buy passage north and perhaps a new start. But that truly shocked her were the documents she found. Letters, dozens of them dating back to 1839. Letters from her father to a lawyer in Philadelphia discussing his plans to free all enslaved people on the Plantation. Letters detailing his growing horror at the institution of slavery, his moral awakening, his determination to act on his conscience regardless of the social and financial consequences. And one final letter, unsealed, addressed to Catherine herself. My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then I have failed to find the courage I needed in life and perhaps have found it only in death. Your mother will tell you I died of heart failure, and perhaps in a sense, I did. My heart failed to be brave enough to stand against the evil I have participated in for so long. While I live, I cannot free those I have enslaved, for your mother will use every legal means to stop me. But I can ensure that upon my death, the means for their freedom exists. The money in this drawer is for you, but I hope you will use it as I could not, to help those who deserve freedom gain it. Forgive me for my cowardice. Forgive me for leaving you alone with your mother's cruelty. You deserved a better father. They deserved a better owner. I deserved a better soul. In the dark study, Catherine stood, her father's words blurring through her tears. Not of heart failure had he died. Overwhelmed by guilt and the impossibility of changing the system he had benefited from, he had taken his own life. And this truth had been hidden by Lucinda, burned the letter he had left, and locked away any evidence of his transformation. The money and the letters were taken by her. But something else was also found by her. Her father's will, never probated, never executed. In it, he left the plantation not to Lucinda, but to Catherine, with explicit instructions that all enslaved people were to be manumitted upon his death. This document had been hidden by Lucinda, continuing to operate the plantation as if she had inherited it legitimately, forging her dead husband's signature on documents that maintained her control. The leverage they needed was this. Proof that could destroy Lucinda's authority, that could challenge the very foundation of her power was this. But access to the legal system, to lawyers and courts that would never listen to an enslaved man or an obese daughter deemed incompetent by her mother would be required to use it. Just as the sky began to lighten, Catherine returned to her room. In the lining of a winter coat that hung in her wardrobe, she hid the documents and money, knowing Lucinda would never search there during the summer months. The next morning, she declared herself recovered and ready to return to the barn. Suspicious but unable to prove malingering, Lucinda agreed, but with a warning that chilled Catherine to her core. Dr. Harrison will visit the barn tomorrow to assess your physical condition, Lucinda announced. That the labor may be too strenuous, he has expressed concern. That you are thriving under this regimen, I have assured him, and I expect you to confirm this. Any suggestion otherwise will result in consequences you will not enjoy. Discovery meant the doctor's visit. The end of everything it meant. Perhaps 24 hours to act, they had. When Catherine returned to the barn and revealed what she had found, the four of them understood they had crossed a threshold. Tools that could challenge Lucinda's power were possessed by them. But escaping the plantation, reaching authorities who might listen, and surviving long enough to tell their story would be required to use those tools. Tonight we leave, Joshua said, his voice carrying a certainty that did not match their desperate situation. All four of us. The money, the documents we take, and we run. They will hunt us, Samuel warned. Every slave patrol in Mississippi will be looking for 3 escaped enslaved men and a white woman. 10 miles we will not make it. But an idea was had by Catherine, born from years of observing her mother's careful manipulation of appearances. Running we will not be. Traveling we will be. A widow traveling with my servants to visit family in Kentucky, I will be. For travel documents from a forger in Natchez, the money will pay. My identity if questioned will be proved by my father's letters. North on a steamboat heading, we just need to reach the river and book passage. A plan with 1,000 ways to fail it was, but the only plan they had it was. The remaining daylight hours were consumed by the preparation for their escape. Without raising suspicion, tasks that had to be completed had each of them a delicate dance of normalcy performed over a foundation of terror. The most dangerous was Samuel's role. After dark, he would need to enter Natchez and locate a forger known only as Crawford, a free black man who operated out of a warehouse near the riverfront. Expensive were the forger's services, and finding him required navigating a city that became increasingly hostile to any black person after sunset. $50 of Catherine's money would be carried by Samuel, enough to purchase basic travel documents, but not so much that losing it would doom the entire plan. On gathering supplies they would need for the journey focused Joshua, food that would not spoil, clothing appropriate for travel, and most importantly, weapons. From the plantation's tool shed, he managed to acquire 2 knives, hiding them in the barn's rafters where no casual inspection would find them. Poor weapons against rifles they were, but they were something. An alibi was Daniel's task to create. After the others left, he would remain at the barn, maintaining the appearance that Catherine was still confined there. In the morning, when Lucinda arrived for her inspection and found Catherine gone, Daniel would claim she had escaped during the night, overpowering him and fleeing alone. A story that would earn him punishment, possibly severe punishment, but it would buy the others time before the alarm was raised. With a solemnity that broke Catherine's heart, the 16-year-old accepted this role. With a tool, she threatened me, I will say, Daniel said, working out the details of his story. Crazed she was, that for my life I feared. That a white woman could frighten me, they will believe. A coward I am, they will believe. Let them believe it. The afternoon was spent by Catherine writing letters. One to her father, though he would never read it, telling him that she had found his hidden will and understood his final act. One to Daniel, thanking him for his sacrifice and promising that if she survived, she would return for him. And one to her mother, though this one she did not plan to send. In it, she detailed every cruelty, every humiliation, every moment of her 19 years when Lucinda had chosen appearance over love, control over compassion. I want her to know, Catherine said as she sealed this final letter. Even if we fail, even if they catch us and kill us, I want her to know that for what she truly is, I saw her. Not a mother, not even a person, just an empty shell wrapped in expensive fabric, mistaking cruelty for strength.